Hello, I'm Kevin Berger, author of Atheism is Untenable, Objecting to the Absence of Belief, Bogus, the Intellectual Dishonesty of Non-Belief, and Debating Dilettante, Transgenderism, and the Unfalsifiability of Identity. Apologetics is a system of arguments in defense of something. That's not what I do here. As someone who is explicitly irreligious and agnostic, I have no need for apologetics and cannot logically shift the burden of proof for an irrelevant claim that I never made in the first place. If you imply otherwise or demand that I prove my God, you will have exposed your own dishonesty and lose any credibility. No, I apply skepticism and polemics to the claims that atheists make, chiefly among them the assertion to not make any claims, which is self-defeating. This is justified nonetheless.
Here recently I've been seeing a lot of comments about whether or not Jesus existed and the ahistoricity angle. And as per the usual, it always is based on, oh, we don't have evidence of this. In fact, I'm looking at a tweet now from the 5th of April from Godless Engineer, and the title right here for this video is "No Evidence Jesus Existed and Never Resurrected Changed My Mind." So let's talk about this again. Jesus mythicists routinely argue that we have reason to doubt the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth, citing that we have no physical evidence to support his claimed existence, no contemporary documentary evidence to support his claimed existence, and that the documents that we do have, like the Gospels, are not eyewitness accounts. However, I'm going to push back on that in a few ways. Firstly, that is potentially an argument from ignorance, the assumption of a conclusion or fact based primarily on the lack of evidence to the contrary, usually best described by an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. As long as the conclusion isn't assumed, and that this is used only to instill doubt, it isn't technically a fallacy, yet it could be. It only becomes fallacious if it's used to draw a conclusion. Be that as it may, a more widely accepted phrasing of this is, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence unless we could reasonably expect evidence to be present if the claim were true. In a small, socially dense, non-isolated community, we would expect contradiction if the figure were fictional. That's only one issue. The second way I'm going to challenge this is that the framing is incorrect. This is not a question of historicity versus ahistoricity. Consider the following syllogism. Premise 1. Either Jesus of Nazareth was historical, or he was not. This is simply a foundational statement of fact. This is where mythicists want to stop. However, that is an illicit rhetorical maneuver, and I will explain why with the rest of the syllogism. Premise 2. If Jesus of Nazareth was not historical, then the figure is not historical in any respect, but is purely fictional. Premise 3. If a figure is purely fictional, then that figure is invented. Lemma. The manner in which a fictional figure comes to exist, whether by single author, multiple authors, deliberate fabrication, gradual legendary development, or syncretic amalgamation, does not alter its status as invented. Lemma 2. The historical or sociological process by which a narrative develops is irrelevant to its ontological classification. If a figure lacks a real historical referent, it is fictional regardless of how the narrative arose. Conclusion, if Jesus of Nazareth was not historical, then he was invented. So we can see that the rhetorical framing is flawed, whether it be deliberately opportunistic or inadvertently misrepresentative. The proper epistemic framing is historicity versus invention. This leads to the third issue. If silence from contemporaries on the existence of Jesus of Nazareth is treated as evidence for ahistoricity, this silence cuts both ways. While you'll find plenty of ancient critics who called Jesus a bastard, a sorcerer, a treasonous malcontent, or a lowlife, you won't find a single one who called him a myth. That is a uniquely modern phenomenon. The actual patient zero for the idea that Jesus never existed appeared only at the tail end of the 18th century, born of an anti-clerical fervor of the French Enlightenment. Before the 1790s, the debate was always about who Jesus was, God, prophet, or fraud, never if he was. The shift happened with two French thinkers who essentially invented the astrotheology school of mythicism. Volney claimed that Jesus was a solar allegory. He argued that Christ was just a derivative of Krishna and that the story was a misunderstanding of the Virgin, the constellation Virgo, bringing forth the sun. Charles-François Dupuy expanded on Volney in a massive 12-volume set. He argued that the 12 apostles were the 12 signs of the zodiac and that Jesus was just the sun personified. Think about the weight of that 1,700-year silence. I'll grant that none of the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. I'll grant that Paul never met Jesus of Nazareth corporeally. I'll even grant, for the sake of argument, that all of the manuscripts were written decades after Jesus was held to have lived. For that matter, to steelman the argument, I'll go with the earliest dated manuscripts as if they are the originals and not copies, in which case we're looking at, say, roughly 150 years after Jesus was held to have lived, as the latest. A century and a half. If we treat silence as evidence for mythicism due to a silence of roughly half a century, then it's that much worse for mythicism because of the silence regarding the challenge to the supposed non-existent person that lasts for a millennium and a half. The early rabbis had every reason to delete Jesus from history. Instead, they wrote about him as a real heretic who led Israel astray. The Romans had every reason to delete Jesus from history and said they persecuted Christians without ever denying the existence of Jesus of Nazareth as a person. The pagan philosophers like Celsus and Porphyry were brilliant polemicists. They spent decades researching Christianity to tear it down. If there was ever even a whisper in Galilee that he was a fake, they would have made it the center of their argument. Instead, they all, without exception, treated him as a historical man. The theory only became academic in a French sense with Bruno Bauer in the 1840s. Bauer was the first to argue from a literary perspective that the Gospel of Mark was a deliberate work of fiction and that the others just copied him. Yet even Bauer's literary argument falls victim to the criterion of unnecessary variation that I've discussed in my earlier videos. If Mark was a pure fiction, why did he include the clunky parts like Jesus not being able to perform miracles in his hometown due to their lack of faith, as stated in Mark 6:5? A fiction writer gives their hero more power. A biographer is stuck with the report that the locals weren't impressed. Mythicism isn't an ancient insight that we lost. It's a modern invention that requires us to ignore the sociological reality of the first century. Ancient critics, he's real, and he's terrible. Modern mythicists, he is or may be completely fictional, and the ancient critics were just too dumb to notice. The Jewish rabbis, Romans, and pagans, who all had good reason to challenge the existence of this person, never once did so. They treated him as an anathema, but a real person. And that brings us to the fourth problem, implausibility. Even in the ancient world, you couldn't just invent a person in a small, close-knit town like Nazareth without everyone laughing you out of the room. The implausibility that an individual could remain unknown or unrecognized within a community is inversely proportional to A, the size and social density of that community, B, the public visibility of the individual's actions, C, the notoriety or salience of those actions, and D, the degree of isolation of that community. Basically, if a person in Indianapolis, Indiana, claims that some guy is publicly performing miracles in Converse, Indiana, which has a population of roughly 1,500 people as of the 2024 census, and the inhabitants of Converse aren't isolated, then the plausibility that no one from Converse would ever dispute that assertion is vanishingly small. Yet, that's effectively what the case is here. Jesus is held to have performed all of these dramatic things in public in Capernaum, which had a similarly sized population. The inhabitants of these villages in Galilee routinely made multiple annual pilgrimages to Jerusalem for celebrations, so they weren't totally isolated. Yet we have no record of anyone from those communities claiming that such a person never existed. Like, what are you talking about? Who's this Jesus guy? I'm from Capernaum. I've never heard of him. Consider this analogy. Possibility 1. A deity manifested corporeally and threw a meteor at the ground, creating a crater. Possibility 2. A meteor just hit the ground, creating a crater. Possibility 3. people dug a hole with spoons for no discernible reason while being watched, and none of the witnesses said, hey, there never was a meteor. Which of these is more parsimonious and reasonable? And with that, we now turn to the final issue, proper application of skepticism, which I could set up with a single innocuous question. Should belief be proportioned to the evidence? Modern armchair skeptics are quick to invoke this quote from David Hume. However, they ignore the rest of the paragraph that explains what that maxim actually entails. After stating that the wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, Hume goes on to say he weighs the opposite experiments. He considers which side is supported by the greater number of experiments. All probability then supposes an opposition of experiments and observations where the one side is found to overbalance the other and to produce a degree of evidence proportioned to the superiority. In all cases, we must balance the opposite experiments where they are opposite and deduct the smaller number from the greater in order to know the exact force of the superior evidence. Notice that Hume says nothing about overwhelmingly superior evidence. The threshold is simply superior. The strength to which the belief is justified is modular. In fact, he explicitly acknowledges that the degree of confidence justified is dependent on the disparity. In other words, epistemic justification requires only that the proposition in question be more likely to be true than untrue. Full stop. Hume's skepticism, then, is a comparative analysis of the respective bodies of warrant for a proposition and its negation by which to make that assessment. If the warrant in favor of the claim exceeds that of the negation, then belief is justified on a provisional basis. And the more evidence there is in favor of the claim relative to the negation, the more strongly that belief can justifiably be held. Thus, for a roll of a pair of fair dice, the belief of an outcome of anything between 2 and 12 is justified. However, anything between 2 and 6 is more justified than between 2 and 4, and less justified than between 2 and 10. Similarly, people are also usually familiar with Sagan's standard that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but not its explanation, mistaking extraordinary to mean something that's simply unusual or different. Yet, in Broca's brain, Sagan writes on page 73, there are many cases where the belief system is so absurd that scientists dismiss it instantly but never commit their arguments to print. I believe this is a mistake. Many scientists seem unwilling to engage in public confrontations on borderline science issues because of the effort required and the possibility they will be perceived to lose a public debate. Scientific aloofness and opposition to novelty are as much of a problem as public gullibility. And later, on page 75, he says, an interesting debate has gone on within the communities between those who think all doctrines smell of pseudoscience should be combated and those who believe that each issue should be judged on its own merits. I find myself very much in the latter camp. I believe that the extraordinary should certainly be pursued, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Within the span of only a few pages, Sagan criticizes scientists for dismissing unconventional claims without public engagement, argues that the controversial ideas should be examined and debated, insists that each issue should be judged based on its own merits, and affirms that the extraordinary should be pursued. Only after establishing this framework does he introduce the evidential proportionality principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Read in sequence, the standard is not a license for dismissal, but a call for rigorous public evaluation of claims in proportion to the evidence. When this broader context is omitted and the final clause is quoted in isolation, the resulting slogan is no longer the result of a full position expressed in the text. If Sagan explicitly criticized scientists for dismissing controversial claims, how should we understand a reading of the standard that encourages dismissal? If you wrote, each issue should be judged on its own merits, what happens when the standard is applied as a blanket rule against categories of claims? If Sagan said the extraordinary should certainly be pursued in the very sentence preceding the evidential requirement, What role was this standard meant to play? Gatekeeping or proportional evaluation? If the surrounding pages emphasize public engagement and debate, is quoting the only final clause an adequate representation of his position? If the evidential requirement appears after a call to investigate, what does that suggest about when the standard was meant to be applied? And if he explicitly criticizes opposition to novelty, how can we then characterize a claim as extraordinary in the same sense that he's using the term in his standard, not based on proportional evidence, but because his claim is simply different, odd, or unique? Read novel. Clearly, while I have $1 million in my checking account is extraordinary in the colloquial sense of everyday usage, that's not what Sagan meant. The reason why I rose from the dead one time is an extraordinary claim isn't that it's unusual, it's because we have more or better contradictory evidence. If there isn't a body of superior contradictory evidence to the claim in question, it's not extraordinary in the sense that Sagan used the term. And Sagan's standard of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence isn't applicable. These questions are not meant to assign motives, but to prompt the person listening or the person reading to infer the best explanation. Several explanations are possible: unfamiliarity with the primary text, the natural tendency to compress ideas into slogans, or motivated selectivity in quotation. However, once the surrounding context is restored and the proximity of these passages recognized, the isolated slogan becomes increasingly difficult to defend as an accurate representation of the author's intended positions. If we affirm that belief should be proportioned to the warrant, it follows that belief in a proposition is justified if the warrant in favor of it exceeds that against it. Belief in the negation is justified if the warrant against the proposition and in favor of the negation tilts the scale in the opposite direction, and the suspension of belief is justified if the respective warrants for the proposition and its negation are equitable. Once we understand that epistemic justification depends on whether a proposition is more likely to be true than untrue, and that belief should be proportioned to the evidence, no doxastic or epistemic justification, including suspension of belief, is justified until after an evaluation of the comparative warrants of the claim versus its negation has been completed. And I'm unconvinced is not evidence, it's not an argument, it's not a standard, and it's not an assessment. It's a psychological self-report. There are billions of people around the world who are convinced of claims despite having insufficient warrant to justify them, and billions more who are unconvinced of claims that have mountains of warrant. See flat earthers, birthers, anti-vaxxers, Holocaust deniers, and moon landing hoaxers. Being convinced or unconvinced tell us absolutely nothing about whether or not the proposition is justified. It's just that person's opinion. Whoop-de-doo. What makes this powerful is the consequence. Once this is granted, anyone claiming justified suspension cannot merely say, I find the claim unconvincing. They must be committed to the claim that the warrant for the proposition and its negation are in equilibrium. In other words, justified suspension is not a vague psychological report, it's a comparative epistemic claim of equipollence. And that means if a mythicist says, I don't believe Jesus was historical because the evidence for historicity is insufficient, one can press, fine. Is your position that the warrant for historicity is less than the warrant for invention, equal to it, or greater than it? Under this schema, there are only three justified options. Either there is greater warrant for historicity, there is greater warrant for invention, or the warrant is equal. No rhetorical fog remains. Applied to the historicity and invention framework, belief in historicity is justified if the warrant for the historicity exceeds that of invention. Belief in mythicism or invention is justified if the warrant for invention exceeds that of historicity. And crucially, suspension of belief is justified when the warrant for both is equitable. Yes, for epistemic justification through the proper application of skepticism, as described by Hume, Sagan, and others, you have to actually compare the warrants. You don't get to sit back on your laurels and say, keep presenting more warrant with some other standard or no standard at all until you are satisfied. No, it is not necessary for either to be demonstrated to be true beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a legal standard for a moral reason. We consider it to be worse to punish an innocent party than to allow a guilty party to go unpunished. That has nothing to do with epistemic justification. And no, none of these are justified simply because the agent is unconvinced. Certainty is not required for epistemic justification either. So if someone says they are just unconvinced by historicity, but they also deny invention, then the only justified middle position left is strict equipoise between the warrant for historicity and the warrant for invention. That is a much stronger burden than most of them want to bear, because most are not actually arguing equality. They are usually arguing asymmetrically against historicity while pretending not to owe any defense of invention. This framework destroys that asymmetry. Now they have nowhere to hide. They must actually evaluate the warrant for both sides and compare them to make a valid assessment or justify any doxastic or epistemic position, including suspension. Yeah, they could say, I'm unconvinced, but that's all. The statement is restricted to the psychological self-report that it is. Oh, you're not convinced of a historical Jesus? I don't care. Flat earthers are unconvinced by the evidence of an oblate spheroid earth. Holocausters are unconvinced by the mountains of evidence. Moon landing hoaxers are unconvinced too. Is their position justified? If yes, then how can anyone validly say another person's position is unjustified? If there is no non-arbitrary standard, any ridicule or charge of gullibility is unfounded, as is any sense of intellectual superiority. If no, then why not? The only coherent answer is because there is superior warrant on one side of the comparison. That means justification isn't determined by whether any particular agent feels convinced or unconvinced. It's determined by a comparative analysis of warrant. Psychological self-reports don't settle the question. Weighing the warrant does. So, applying this question of historicity versus invention, let P equal Jesus was a historical figure, so that WP equals the warrant for historicity, and then they can argue that WP is insufficient and that it's unjustified. What this syllogism does is it sets not P as Jesus was not a historical figure, and then not P was invented, so that W not P is warrant for invention. Then the comparative analysis becomes warrant for historicity versus warrant for invention, which is a very different evaluation. I have argued that even if we toss out every document, biblical and extra-biblical, that mentions Jesus of Nazareth, it's still more parsimonious and reasonable to think that a historical Jesus lived than to think that he was just made up. I submit, again, the minimum assumptions for each. For historicity, a guy lived. He was sensationalized posthumously. For invention, no such person existed. A fabrication was perpetrated to create him whole cloth. This fictional person was passed off as real in a sparsely populated community. No one in that community ever questioned that fabrication. No one ever questioned the fabrication for a millennium and a half, and all evidence of the fabrication was either lost or destroyed. And this is while even touching the conspiratorial aspects of the fabrication. Of course, none of this proves that Jesus was in fact a historical figure. However, collectively, it makes the idea of a whole cloth fabrication of a non-existent person vanishingly implausible. There's a reason why Jesus mythicism is a fringe theory rejected by Christian, religious, and atheist scholars. It's a theory that simply does not hold up to even a modicum of objective scrutiny. A figure is either non-fictional or fictional. These are exclusive and exhaustive. If the figure is not historical, they are not non-fiction. If they are not non-fiction, they are fictional, per the principle of excluded middle. If they are even partially inspired by a person, that person makes them historical, even if only trivially so. To say otherwise is to split imaginary hairs. Does that prove historicity? No. Does it show that the dissenter can't rely solely on insufficient evidence of existence? Yes. You don't get that for free. Consider the Three Musketeers. Alexandre Dumas provided fictionalized versions of many historical characters who are only tenuously identifiable as their real-life counterparts. Yet that doesn't negate the fact that those figures did exist in some form. The dissenting argument essentially suggests that because Athos, Porthos, and Aramis deviated from Armand d'Athos, Isaac de Portal, and Henri d'Armitz, they're ahistorical, that one is unjustified in believing that they were real. But they were, in fact, real. What Dumas wrote were fictionalized accounts of actual people. If the dissenter wishes to argue for mythicism, they cannot also have actual people, because actual people concedes historicity, even if only trivially so. To be clear, I'm not defending the narrative as provided in the Bible. I'm explicitly rejecting that baggage that presumes inerrancy and univocality, etc. What I am doing is I'm disputing the rationale of mythicists. They want insufficient evidence for historicity, therefore mythicism is justified, or at least insufficient evidence for historicity, therefore belief in historicity is unjustified. My goal is only to demonstrate that doesn't follow, because they haven't conducted a comparative analysis of the respective bodies of warrant to validate that, reducing it to a question of whether or not they're convinced. That's psychology, not epistemology, not justification, and not skepticism. That's denialism, or at least cynicism. The argument I make isn't that every text is 100% accurate, but that it is more likely than not that a living person lived and was potentially sensationalized posthumously. Appealing to, well, maybe this is a hybrid case where a legend developed around over a period of time, is exactly what I'm proposing as the most likely scenario. Now, if someone wants to say that a legend developing around a person who actually lived, on whom the legend was loosely based, leans more toward mythological than historical, I mean, okay, but then I'll point out that any number of works of historical fiction, even minimal historical grounding, however distorted, counts as historicity in the relevant sense. Some will try to spin this off into a third option as legendary development around a minimal historical core, but that doesn't break the binary. If there is any historical person at the core, even minimally, then the figure is historical in the relevant sense. Legendary accretion is what normally happens to actual people. I give an in-depth account of deified historical figures versus humorized mythological characters in my video, recalculating the posterior probability of a historical Jesus. That is not evidence against historicity. It is the expected process given historicity. Full mythicism still requires the stronger claim of no historical referent whatsoever. Pure invention. That is a position that must carry its own warrant in the comparison. Long story short, sorry, but legendary accretion is a subset of historicity, not a separate category. In the relevant sense, historical includes any figure with a real referent, however distorted. Consider the following scenario. An author decides to tell a story about a character named Luis Mierda del Toro, who was born a pauper and grew to be a person of fame. He gives few details on this character's early life and family, focusing instead on his adulthood and rise in stature with the intent of passing him off as a real character. A second author runs with the story of Luis, effectively plagiarizing the earlier tale and adding information that was not present in the earlier tale. This author writes that Luis, though a pauper, was actually descended from a family of some importance and renown within the city of Madrid. He notes that Luis himself was born in Madrid and carefully lays out in great detail the lineage of Luis, going back many generations, in an effort to establish the credibility of the story. Then he thinks to himself, lineage sounds a lot like linea, and for no good reason, he decides to make a pun about Luis being from a city known as La Linea, which, despite being argued as fictitious as Luis, is a real place. He simply cannot resist the urge to include this pun and thereby create tension in the narrative that is easily avoidable. Later, a third author, having read both of the previous two stories, decides to plagiarize both and write an adaptation of his own, complete with his own version of Luis's family tree. Then, for no good reason, writes that Luis had traveled from La Linea to Madrid because he had to register to vote there, despite that being untrue and there being no such legal requirement, and both Luis and La Linea allegedly being fictional anyway, rendering the inclusion of such a journey pointless, as the author could simply write Luis in Madrid from the start, and such an omission would reduce the tension in the narrative, making it more credible. Luis is said to have performed many acts of wonder by each author, and to have ultimately become an enemy of the state who was executed publicly. Despite many spectacular and public acts attributed to Luis during his time in La Linea, no one challenges that he was real for 1700 years, not even his enemies who have motives to do so. If this convoluted, incoherent mess of an explanation for the development of the narrative of Luis Guillermo del Toro seems like it's overreaching and implausible, though possible, it should. Yet this is essentially the Jesus mythicist argument. A more reasonable explanation is that Luis was a real person known to be a resident of La Linea, and the authors being constrained by that fact, yet wanting to reconcile this with their need to place him in Madrid in their narratives. The point here being that the authors being constrained by established fact makes more sense than making a purely fictional account overly complicated without need, particularly if the goal is for people to believe it. This is unequivocally the more parsimonious explanation. The same is true of the development of the narrative surrounding Jesus of Nazareth. A more reasonable explanation is that Jesus was a real person known to have been from Nazareth, a place for which there is archaeological evidence to support its existence, and the authors being constrained by that fact, yet wanting to reconcile this with their need to place him in Bethlehem in their narratives, linking him to the overtly referenced prophecy. And for non-native Spanish speakers, Mierda del Toro means bullshit, which is exactly how I feel about Jesus mythicism. Finally, I submit the following set of syllogisms. First, my criterion for unnecessary variation, which is essentially a historical critical version of the existing literary principle lectio difficilior poterior. Premise 1. Authors attempting to fabricate believable narratives tend to minimize unnecessary complications. Premise 2. The gospel accounts contain unnecessary complications. Premise 3. Such complications are better explained by authors working under external constraints than by free invention. Conclusion. Therefore, the accounts are more plausibly constrained by historical realities than freely fabricated. Second, my plausibility of sustained anonymity principle. Premise 1. The plausibility that an individual remains unknown in a community decreases as community density, visibility of actions, and notoriety increase. Premise 2. The gospel narratives describe a figure operating in a small, socially dense community, performing highly visible and salient actions. Premise 3. Therefore, if such a figure were entirely fictional, it would be highly probable that the members of those communities would recognize and challenge the claim. Premise 4. There is no such record of recognition or challenge. Conclusion. Therefore, the hypothesis was that the figure was purely fictional is highly implausible. And finally, an argument based on Occam's razor and inference to best explanation. Premise 1. When multiple competing explanations exist, explanation that requires fewer ad hoc assumptions and less coordination is more rationally justified. Premise 2. The hypothesis that Jesus was entirely fabricated requires no such person existed. A person was fabricated whole cloth by multiple authors who were copying one another. Unnecessary tension that was introduced into the narratives. The fictional person was passed off as real in a sparsely populated community. No one in that community ever questioned the fabrication, and all evidence of the fabrication was either lost or destroyed. Premise 4. The hypothesis that Jesus was a historical individual later embellished requires a real person existed, later theological development. Conclusion. Therefore, the historical Jesus hypothesis is more parsimonious and rational than full mythicism. So, while I cannot definitively say that Jesus of Nazareth lived as an actual historical figure, I am extremely comfortable saying it's more likely than not, and that, therefore, belief to that effect is justified. The fabrication explains the data by multiplying assumptions and requires explaining why a completely unconstrained narrative became constrained by the introduction of tension, something we would not expect from deliberate fiction intended to be persuasive. Historicity, by contrast, explains the data by constraint. The presence of tension is exactly what we would expect if the authors were working within the limits of underlying historical realities. Until next time, remember, even if your beliefs aren't necessarily true, they may be justified nonetheless.